Let me welcome all of you to, I think this is our 19th session in this series on worlds of speculative fiction. This one is focused on Howard Phillips Lovecraft, great early 20th century. He preferred the term weird writer. I think nowadays we classify him as horror, but really he straddles fantasy and science fiction as well. Just a giant in the world of speculative fiction. So this series, we have some new people. I'm very happy to see that. This series focuses on the narrative worlds and looks at some of the philosophical themes involved. We have a lot of discussion and back and forth. We can stop at any time and often do. Sometimes we get into various digressions, but that's okay. I have some notes prepared, but they're usually fairly loose. So anytime you want to say something or ask a question or make a comment, don't feel shy about that. I'm Greg Sadler. I'm you could say, local practicing and public philosopher. I was in academics for a long time. Now I'm in, you could say, private practice. Part of that is doing public events like this. And the library's been hosting this now for about a year and a half. And the rest of the people here are regulars in this, so we've talked about a number of really interesting thinkers. And what we usually do is we start out with talking about some biographical context and literary context, and then go into the narrative world itself. And then I usually have some philosophical themes picked out, but it's rare that we don't have other people bringing in some as well. So the ones that I picked for this one, and Lovecraft is one of these thinkers where we've almost got an embarrassment of riches when it comes to themes. The ones that I picked out were the notion of the weird tale, as Lovecraft saw it, and then science, rationalism, and nature, cosmic pessimism, describing the indescribable, which is something he actually has a story where he's playing around with that idea in a funny way. A theme that I couldn't think of a better way to phrase, a pithier way. So I'm just calling it Why Humans Cooperate with the Sources of Horror. And then we'll talk, if we have time, about the sort of the implications of Lovecraft's racism and Anglophilia, which is pretty inescapable when you read his stuff. So I've given you a timeline and some quotes from some of his essays and works that I think could be interesting. Before we go into it, just a few general remarks. So I mentioned that Lovecraft is really a giant in speculative fiction. I don't think that there's an author in this sort of domain of weird tales who has the stature that he does. He's influenced so many other people. One of the books that I checked out just for fun from the downtown library is this Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, and I didn't get it for the Lovecraft stuff. I got it because it's got all these other stories by it's H.P. Lovecraft in diverse hands. So it's Lovecraft and August Derleth, his probably biggest follower, you could say, but also people like Fritz Leiber, who we're going to talk about later on down the line, or Carl Edward Wagner, or Philip Jose Farmer, even Stephen King. And some of them are more successful, I think, in turning their hand to the playing around with Lovecraftian ideas. Some of them are less so. But you can ask the question, well, why are these people? Why are they doing that? Is it just kind of a nerdy fascination with some obscure author? No, he's really somebody who influenced the whole field of writers, even at those outside of horror or weird or supernatural fiction. I think some of what we see today, because some of the things have become part of pop culture, like you can buy yourself a Cthulhu knit cap, right? For winter with the tentacles and things like that. And there's Cthulhu for President posters and bumper stickers every 4 years. The slogan being "Vote for the greater of the two evil," or vote for the greatest evil, right? But why did it become such a fascinating thing. Well, there's something about Lovecraft's writings, and I'm actually, I'll actually get on a little bit of a soapbox. So I hadn't read Derleth before, and I'd read about him, and knew that he was probably the most prolific author working with Lovecraft's ideas, and I was really primed to appreciate him, in part because he also sets a lot of his stories here in Wisconsin, right? And when I compare Lovecraft's prose to Derleth's prose, Derleth unfortunately just couldn't measure up. There's something missing in the way that he does things. There's something a little bit overblown. Lovecraft knows, at least in my view, I think a lot of other people said his writing is terrible. It's too much of this. But I think Lovecraft goes just up to the limit with the Cyclopean architecture and non-Euclidean geometry and indescribable horrors and all these other things. He goes right up to the limit and doesn't go beyond it. I think Derleth just wasn't as good of a writer, and so I was Wisconsin stories, I was really primed for it to be really great, but it didn't turn out to be so. Some of the other writers were a bit more successful, but they were people who were very established in their own right, like Fritz Leiber or Philip Jose Farmer. Now, I got into Lovecraft myself. I when I was trying to think about how long it's been, I think I started reading him maybe in middle school. I don't think I was reading him in elementary school, but I remember reading a lot of Lovecraft stories back then, and he's somebody who I've been returning to off and on. I suspect that I didn't really understand 2/3 of what I was reading back then, and it helped to learn some things in philosophy to actually make sense out of what he was talking about in some points. So I'll try to hit on some of those ideas here and there in a way that I hope will be helpful. Very pleasantly surprised to find out that my daughter, who is a teenager, has been reading Lovecraft for several years without telling me. Found out this summer. That's great, I don't know where she got the idea from, but apparently the kids are reading Lovecraft, so it's great, We have a whole new generation doing it, right? It's going to live on. And I'd actually be curious to find out, too, from those of you, is this something you just read for this time, or have you been long-standing Lovecraft fans, or maybe you're not fans, maybe you think he's bad, but you're drawn to reading him, or for some reason, or?
I'd say high school, and more for the themes. I actually don't really care for his narrative.
His prose?
Yeah, I find it very difficult, but I find his ideas very interesting.
So the ideas are worth enough to wade through the turgid prose.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have the same reaction?
Actually, I confess to not having read much Lovecraft at all. No, I was laughing more because I've heard that expressed about Philip K. Dick. His writing not being very good, but the ideas are good.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I find with Dick it's more the opposite thing, where his writing is very sparse.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's not like moss hanging over.
Right.
Yeah.
Very dense.
Yeah. What about the rest of you?
I read him in high school too. And then I kind of
Let him go.
gained perspective. I thought his ideas were beautiful rather than horrifying. Like he's afraid of weird stuff, and I think the weird stuff is fascinating. So
Okay.
that's kind of the new weird wave of writers. I think it's they take the ideas but write them better.
Yeah. That's actually good. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. Why does the unknown have to be so horrifying? He just sort of seems to assume that. Although he has characters who get fascinated, right? Mm-hmm. But that's always a sign that they're off the deep end. Going to get in trouble. Did you guys have a chance to read?
I had a science fiction course in college many, many years ago. So I was reading several authors, including some H.P. Lovecraft, but it's not current in my mind to reflect on what I thought at that time comparative to other writers.
It's interesting that they included him in science fiction, though, I think. It makes sense, but I think there's a lot of people who just push him off into horror, and that's that for him. you know.
Mm-hmm. That's why I'm here. I don't know too much about him, so I wanted to learn more.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Same.
Well, that's excellent. So let's talk about his life. You notice it's not very long, and actually, he lived in pretty crippling poverty for a good portion of it. Actually, by the time that he died, he was, living on rations that we would see as essentially starvation stuff. He's born in Providence. There's actually a Lovecraft Museum in Providence that I'm still kicking myself for not having visited. The one time I gave a talk in Providence, but we were going through very quickly. And that was really that in New York were the main places that he lived over the course of his life. Providence through most of it. And his father exits his life fairly quickly. By the time that he's 3, his father has a psychotic break, gets institutionalized in this Butler hospital, which Lovecraft's family is going to have a pretty bad relationship with over time. Already by that time, though, Lovecraft is a very bright, precocious boy, starts reciting poetry, memorizing it. He actually wrote a lot of poetry in his lifetime. I have to admit, I haven't read more than just a bit of his poetry because I'm more interested in the stories and his essays. But he wrote an awful lot, and he thought that poetry was quite important. Begins writing poems by the time that he's 6. And by the time that he's 8, his father dies. So his father's been out of his life. What ended up happening is his mother moved him in with their grandfather and 2 aunts. So he has a sort of some paternal example in the place. And Lovecraft begins attending this Slater Avenue school, but he's not going to last long there. He's going to get pulled out due to his ill health. And he encounters one of the people who's going to really influence him, Edgar Allan Poe, another great horror writer. And one of the first passages that I have for you in this set is actually his assessment of Poe. So we'll come back to that in just a bit. He starts producing his own magazines by the time that he's 9. And so the first one is this Scientific Gazette. So he's clearly somebody who is very creative, also very practical, very interested in astronomy, in science. And this is, of course, a time where science is making these great advances. There's kind of a clash going on between more traditional ways of looking at the world and the modern scientific way of looking at it. He also starts a journal of astronomy, and then some catastrophe happens when his grandfather dies. The mismanagement of the estate ends up with him, the whole family having to move into a smaller house. This is sort of the beginning of a long series of setbacks that are going to happen. He also gets his start in writing not just things that he's sort of churning out himself, but in a journal by sending in a letter on astronomy to this Providence Sunday Journal. He's correcting people who've got things wrong, and they invite him to do some more writing, which he does. And think about this: he's a kid who's showing that he's got some intelligence and some talent. He ends up having a nervous breakdown, unfortunately, doesn't finish high school, is not able to enter Brown University. These he sees as major setbacks in his life. And then he starts publishing other things. He publishes this letter that he sends to the pulp magazine Argosy, gets published. And again, he's working essentially as a literary critic. He's invited to join this United Amateur Press Association, and this is going to start opening up doors for him and connecting him with other people. He starts going to conventions and associations, and people can tell that this guy really can write, and he starts to get offers to do things. You notice from this point on, we're going to have all these stories published. Lovecraft never publishes a novel in the course of his life. He publishes a few novellas, but he never writes anything that would be novel length. Almost all of this is published in what we now call pulp. Well, they called it back then. And these were magazines that were, why were they called pulp? Because they were on the cheapest paper possible so that they could be super cheap for the people to buy. A lot of what was going into these was not of particularly high quality, so they had a bad reputation. But some of them appealed to, sort of baser instincts, let's say. A lot of true crime stuff was pulp, and if you've ever seen any of these old true crime things, the covers are very lurid. It's not enough just to have somebody strangling somebody. If there's a woman involved, you probably see a good portion of her chest. We complain about comic book people, how they draw heroines at this time. There's the same sort of weird gyrations. A lot of blood, a lot of sensationalism going on. And so Lovecraft is, he's not writing, he's writing great literature, but he's not writing in a forum that's really devoted to great literature. I mean, if he, at the time, if his goal was to write literature with a capital L, he would be, sending off to other journals where the paper costs more, and it's got a higher sort of level of clientele, and you're not seeing it in the drugstores. Yeah.
Is there a break here, or am I misunderstanding? Was his early writing, for Scientific Gazette and Astronomy, that sounds like nonfiction, like science writing. So then by the time he gets up to, what, age 23 or something, or 33?
When he's publishing
for Argosy is obviously, pulp fiction.
Yeah.
I think of it, as, so he makes a big switch here, but we don't know why.
Well, he likes writing stories. He continues. I don't have any like his nonfiction on here. All I did was put his.
Well, but he's writing for he's publishing or editing or whatever. I don't know.
He's also
Scientific Gazette and Astronomy.
There's no break. It's just he's writing across the board. He's writing scientific stuff, sort of popular science stuff. He's writing stories. He's writing poetry. On the timeline again, all I did was put his stories, but he's got all sorts of other essays.
Okay. But is the Conservative, is that now not a science publication?
That's more of like I guess we call it nonfiction. Yeah. Cultural and political stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so which is to me another break or another.
Yeah.
It's a deviation.
You could say.
Well, yeah, but it's a different road travel. I don't know. No, that's fine. He's just like.
I think you could see it less as a break and more of adding something to the repertoire. Sort of like somebody, like a musician who starts out playing piano, and now they play piano and guitar, and now they play piano, guitar, and the trombone. There's nothing being. It would be a break if he never did the other stuff again, but he continues writing some things throughout the course of his life. He can get paid for writing the pulp stuff. Not well. Nobody was. I suppose the editors were probably making decent money on it, and the owners, but the writers weren't. But I think there was more money in doing that sort of thing. And he clearly liked writing these sorts of stories. But he does write a lot of what we would call creative nonfiction essays. Responding to the time. So during the First World War, he writes some things having to do with war. He writes literary reviews of different people. So yeah, he's very prolific. I have to admit, I've mostly just read the stories and some of the essays, and a few of the poems. I'm not really a big poetry guy, unfortunately. So. Well, let's go on. So let's go on with this. He actually tries to enlist in the National Guard, but he's in terrible health, so he fails the physical. Eventually, his mother gets committed to Butler Hospital. Then Lovecraft encounters one of his next major literary influences, this Lord Dunasay, who we've got another passage about him in there. And his mother is going to die in that same hospital with a failed gallbladder operation. I guess back then that was kind of a risky venture. And it's not long after that that Lovecraft meets this woman, Sonia Green. She's from New York, but she's going to end up living in other places as well. And they click very quickly. She is kind of a take-charge person. He's more of a dreamer, although he could get some things done. But she's much more practical than he is. And his two aunts are very surprised by how quickly he connects up with her and then decides that they're going to get married. And they're against it. He marries her. He ends up moving to New York to live with her for a short time. While he's in New York, he ends up, in some degree of poverty. Things start out fairly good, and then they start to go downhill. And by the end, he's living in a tenement in Red Hook, subsiding on whatever he can eat. Sonia has gone elsewhere to look for work, in Cleveland, and eventually he decides to move back to Providence. It doesn't appear, interestingly, she was a writer later on, and she wrote a bit about their life together. She said that he performed satisfactorily, his husbandly duties, but not, superbly or anything like that. He was competent, you could say.
That's almost worse somehow
than incompetent. Yeah, well, I suppose at the time, they're probably more incompetent or health class, and sort of more openness about that. But she, she's sort of on the move, and their marriage really, it's not much of a marriage for a good portion of it. And eventually, she decides, they should get divorced, and he's okay with it. They have an amicable divorce. She finds out after he dies, he never signed the papers, and she got married in the meantime to somebody else. So, fortunately, they didn't check up on this sort of thing. They would have caused a lot of problem. Now, notice he's getting very productive during these years. He moves back to Providence. He's also engaged with a whole network of other writers, some of whom you could say are his peers, and then some of whom are you might say almost like his proteges, or he's helping them out. He's doing what we would nowadays, I suppose, call coaching. So there's a lot of correspondence between him and other authors, some of whom might surprise you, like Robert Howard, who writes these Conan books. Right? He and Lovecraft have a very strong connection. Derleth, of course, and he's not very old. He's 47 when he dies of cancer of the small intestine, and apparently swelling of the kidneys. He won't go to the doctor. And he ends up, dying as a result. And he leaves behind some other manuscripts that do get published later. I didn't put that in the timeline because I wanted to just keep it one page. But there's some others that weren't published by then. And, in his lifetime, I guess you could say he was recognized by his fans. And he was recognized by the other writers who he was influencing, but he didn't have anything like the almost cult status that he has today. So, typical story of, we often talk about, well, artists only become famous after they die. That really is the case with Lovecraft. And his works, the value that they have. I mean, if he had been around today, I suppose, he would have realized a lot of wealth from his writing, but he didn't get that in his own time. And he might, his last year, apparently he was in terrible pain much of the time, but still writing. So that's his biography, kind of a sad story, isn't it? Of this guy. Let's talk about the universe that he creates. So now we start actually getting right into philosophical themes because we're talking about cosmology. Lovecraft, I think it's safe to say, throughout all these stories, the only characters that are generally going to be recurring are non-human, bad guys. These godlike creatures, the elder things or great old ones, some that he calls the outer gods. Those are recurring in this, but most of the stories will be about one person or a set of people, usually engaged in some sort of exploration or research project, or trying to stop some terrible calamity that they've realized is about to happen, and we don't pick up with them afterwards. So in a way, it's sort of like, when we did Ian Banks and the Culture series, and it's the culture itself was the thing that held everything together. I suppose you could say that about Lovecraft himself, well, his stories itself. So what is his universe like? Well, it's a universe in which human beings are not particularly important, and certainly not anywhere near as important as we make ourselves out to be, where our theories of how the universe itself got started and what its history was like are mostly wrong. And the real story is far more vast and cyclopean and terrible than we could ever imagine. And if we could, pierce the veil on it, we would probably go insane. And let me actually read you one of the quotes then from the Call of Cthulhu. He says, this is how he begins it. "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." So either we would go just totally nuts, or we would burn all of our books and destroy all of our apparatus so we can go back to being primitive barbarians, because at least they weren't troubled by thoughts of how horrifying the universe truly is. And so why does he say that sort of thing? Well, on the Earth, there is like a whole prehistory that we discover in the stories by encountering bits and pieces of it, of all sorts of intelligent races before us. And we're just sort of a blip on the horizon. And we've developed science, and that's really cool, but the science that we have is just child's play compared to what these other beings had. And they weren't even all on the same page. There's, I sort of printed out a timeline here just to try to keep it straight in my head. He has, for example, the universe being created, then we've got the planet Earth formed, and about 1 billion years ago, the Elder Things arrive on Earth, and the Elder Things are one of these races. And this is what we're going to find out about in, say, the novella At the Mountains of Madness, which is about Antarctica, and they find this vast, ruined city where all the previous owners are either frozen or dead, and the creatures that they made out of muck, essentially, the Shoggoths, to do their work for them, have gone crazy and are doing their own thing. The Elder Things spread across the entire Earth for a while. They adapt to land. Then we have another race, the Flying Polyps, right? It sounds kind of silly, right? But they start building these giant basalt towers. They get into a war with the Elder Things, wars that are on the scale of our great world wars that we think about. The Elder Things start creating the kind of life that we now see as part of the evolutionary chain. They start making fish, they start making reptiles and things like that. Then we get other races and creatures coming in. The great race of Yith who can transport their minds into other beings and that way avoid death. We have the great old ones coming down from the stars. And by that, we're talking about Cthulhu, this horrifying octopus, mountainous creature. It's described in various different ways. Who winds up being worshipped in sort of areas of the world, like the Eskimos up in Greenland, making statues to him, and a voodoo cult getting associated with it. I mean, Lovecraft is drawing on sort of the ethnology available to him at the time, but he's weaving this story in which there's so much more going on behind the scenes that we could possibly be aware of, and that's just like sort of the big picture. Then there's stories where a painter, for example, likes to paint ghouls, and these ghoul creatures do exist down in the sewers and subways and catacombs. And there's a story, Pickman's Model. Pickman is able to do these really vivid, scary paintings of ghouls, in part because he actually uses real ghouls as his artist model. And there's even more terrifying creatures down there. So there's all these, to use a phrase that Lovecraft likes to employ, eldritch forces, right? Now, so you could say, well, these must be understood as like fantasy or supernatural horror stuff. Lovecraft it does make sense to call it science fiction, because he's saying this is all scientific. It's just a science that's much further advanced than the science that we know. So Cthulhu coming down from the stars, or these other creatures coming down from space, they're actually relying on an understanding of the universe that eclipses our own understanding of the universe. They understand how to make their way through space and time. They understand how to open up gaps between the stars or different dimensions. They have a better understanding, and when they create their cities or create other places, the architecture itself reflects again, another phrase he loved, non-Euclidean, geometrical way of understanding things. I think nowadays, if we take geometry classes, we're not so enthused about that word, non-Euclidean, because we learned very early on in a college geometry class that Euclid was actually just one way of looking at the world, and there's other ways of understanding the relationship between parallel lines and all of that. But for them, this is at his time, this is sort of like a scary concept. There are our notions of space and time as being something constant that we can rely upon. That was what Lovecraft was playing with, being shaken. So I would say, I don't know, it's hard to estimate this. How many of the characters meet terrible ends in Lovecraft's stories? Probably a good 50% of them. After they communicate to us what they have to tell us about, the horrors that they're seeing. So we only, it's a narrative world that we get to see piece by piece. There are some constants in it. So I mentioned, these great beings, right, that are almost beyond our comprehension. There's also a literature and a lore that Lovecraft will appeal to in story after story. He's the guy who came up with the word, the Necronomicon. So that's made its way into pop culture now, and people envision it as a book that's got an eye on it or teeth or something like that. It's bound with somebody's flesh, and you open it up and terrible things happen, right? So I think Evil Dead used it. The Australian movie Dead Alive used it as well, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken about that. And it keeps getting recycled. So the Necronomicon was supposed to be this book written by this mad Arab who actually encountered these cosmic beings, and it drove him insane, but he wrote things down. And it was translated into various languages, and so, fortunately, we possess the one in Latin by, I'm trying to remember his name, his last name is Wormius, and so there's books like that. And then Lovecraft makes up locations, too. A lot of them are in New England, like Miskatonic University, which has the Necronomicon. And you've got, and then, of course, the Cthulhu Mythos stuff that other people write uses this as well. So, the Miskatonic University is on the Miskatonic River, which doesn't, of course, exist, but you could imagine existing somewhere in New England. And there's all these other places that are constants in this universe, in this narrative universe. So, that's probably enough about the narrative universe. Before we go into these philosophical themes, any comments or reactions or things you want to hit on that particularly struck you? Rereading or reading Lovecraft? Things you found infuriating, puzzling?
This world you're talking about, is this recurring throughout his work?
Yeah, some of the stories more than others. And there is, I should also mention, there is a set of stories that wind up being set in other places that don't exist, more fantasy-oriented ones, like the one about the cats of Uthar, which is very interesting. That's a more fantasy story, less horror story, except for, I guess, the two people who were the bad people who got eaten by the cats. So there's places like that. Once they're written, Lovecraft can invoke them or not invoke them. Usually it's always, the connections are always at kind of a distance. It's like, I heard this story about such and such, The fixed points are things like Miskatonic University, these texts, and in some of the stories at least, these primal creatures that run the show. But he never gives, there's no story where he gives us a revelation of the totality of it.
Oh, okay, but it's like Faulkner and that county he made up, whose name I've never
I suppose.
Okay.
That could be an analogy, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I saw in your thing, it says the Enderworld thing. I'm like, well, which one's in this? Which stories do I read? Which one? And then I thought, I'll just come here and I'll figure it out.
Yeah, so some of the stories are, this is actually a good place to talk a bit about the evolution of his writing and his thought. So the Lovecraft scholars, and there's many of them out there because people love writing on Lovecraft, they talk in terms of three main phases of his work. And the first phase, he's kind of under the influence of Poe, and a lot of his early juvenilia, we call them, are sort of in that vein. So it wouldn't be bad to, at this point, talk about what he says about Poe. He says, before Poe, the bulk of weird writers had worked largely in the dark, without an understanding of the psychological basis of the horror appeal, and hampered by more or less of conformity to certain empty literary conventions, such as the happy ending, virtue rewarded, and in general a hollow moral didacticism, acceptance of popular standard of values, and the striving of the author to obtrude his own emotions into the story and take his sides of the partisans of the majority's artificial ideas. So that's typical Lovecraft, right? The majority, if they only knew what things were really like, they wouldn't be so sanguine. Poe, on the other hand, perceived the essential impersonality of the real artist, knew that the function of creative fiction is merely to express and interpret events and sensations as they are, regardless of how they tend or what they prove, good or evil, attractive or repulsive, stimulating or depressing, with the author always acting as a vivid and detached chronicler, rather than as a teacher, sympathizer, or vendor of opinion. So what's the result of this? He says, Poe's specters acquired a convincing malignity possessed by none of their predecessors, and established a new standard of realism in the annals of literary horror. The impersonal and artistic intent was aided by a scientific attitude not often found before, whereby Poe studied the human mind rather than the usages of Gothic fiction, and worked with an analytical knowledge of terror's true sources, which doubled the force of his narratives and emancipated him from all the absurdities inherent in merely conventional shutter quoting. So he's saying Poe has really accomplished something new, and he follows along with that. So some of his early writings would be fitting into that sort of sequence. So, like the rats in the wall, I would say, are kind of along those lines.
What does he mean, conventional shutter pointing?
Following along the conventions of the writers before them who are trying to produce this, fear effect. But they're using just sort of cliches.
Like shutter,
Yeah.
Shutter coining.
Yeah,
he's
convention.
waxing.
If you said mere
He's
convention,
he's waxing poetical here.
Well, with a mercenary implication, too.
Oh, you mean like making money on shutters?
Yeah, like people who are just writing
I think
craft to sell it.
I suppose, but I think he's talking more about like when we talk about coining a phrase, right? Here you're coining a shutter. You're
coining an emotion or a fear.
Well, yeah, but it's in a very stereotyped way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're just sort of following along the old paths.
Well, I just have sort of a question I went
Yeah.
back to before when you were talking about the different worlds that he set up and these beings that came in and the idea that if mankind knew how this was, it would just be too much and they'd all go off and shoot themselves or something.
Yeah.
It sounds more like rather than having a curiosity about it, it was more of a fear of everything. So was it, like?
You mean on Lovecraft's part, or on?
Yeah, that he's trying to portray through this as I don't, and probably as a writer, because he's just obviously making this up as fiction.
Yeah.
But was the idea to, I imagine the idea was to horrify, because it wasn't he didn't seem to come off like this is really. Look at how great we can discover something through these beings, as opposed to just, my God, this is so horrible, we can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So was it more just to keep that whole idea of shutter, of horror going, than it was to have a curiosity about this, about what could be?
Some of the characters start out, one of the character arcs that you see in quite a few of these is characters who are curious about, say, the occult or antiquated things or things that other people aren't paying attention to, right? And so they start delving into it, and then they start getting excited about the discoveries that they're making. A lot of them are explorers or researchers. And they start to realize that they're getting in a little bit too deep. And then they start to find out what's really, well, at least a portion of what's really going on. Sometimes they're actually like opposed by other people who are in league with these dark forces, right? And by the time you get to the end of most of those stories, they're in too deep. They're not going to get out. And either they've gone insane or they left behind one of Lovecraft's favorite devices is I found this story that somebody wrote down. Because that way you can have a character who meets their end and all of that. But yeah, so you could say curiosity doesn't kill the cat, but it leads the cat into a whole set of traps, and those traps are finding out how bad things actually are.
Okay, well, with Poe, because he didn't really set up worlds or anything, he just basically, his writings were more horror. It was a story and this would happen.
Yeah, they're set in this world for them, if you think about it.
And then it was,
yeah.
Whether, take what was a Telltale Heart or the Casket of Amontillado, any of those. It's a story focusing on something that's a horrific act that's going to be happening to these people or the bastard or whatever. So, but with So I don't, because I don't even remember much. I read some Lovecraft years and years ago. I don't remember how much of it was, but I don't remember but just when you were talking about the fact of this world, and it just seemed like he was only perpetrating that to induce, again, fear and horror, rather than, like, this is something that could be explored or looked at.
Or did he, I'm just going back to that paragraph you read before Poe, and whoever wrote that doesn't really say, but it says that the function
that's
of creative...
Lovecraft.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, that's from his essay.
So anyhow, so he's saying that this is his view, that the function of creative fiction is merely to express and interpret events and sensations as they are, as perceived by him, regardless of whether they tend to be good or evil, attractive or repulsive, stimulating or depressive. So he's chosen evil, repulsive, and depressing as a way of chronicling what he sees.
So he's trying to do.
Yeah, he could. Yeah. You're right. He could just as well as have taken uplifting stories, rather than,
Because another quote from Lovecraft is that one of the oldest and strongest of human emotions.
That's how he begins that essay. Yeah,
fear, and the strongest source of fear is the unknown.
Yeah.
So that sort of seemed to drive his.
Well, that's what I was thinking. That he perceives, and he perceives through his writing, he's trying to get more of the unknown as being fearful rather than as being something to explore or be curious and something.
Another theme that comes up too, and he talks about this in 2 other essays: some notes on a non-entity, and then notes on writing weird fiction. He says that part of what's going on in a weird tale is that you suspend sort of fixed cosmic law or order that we tend to rely upon, and you can do that.
Disbelief. You suspend disbelief.
You rely. So you're suspending disbelief specifically in this that things could somehow just be different than we think that they are. If you think about the advances that were being made by science and technology in his time, and the fact that they, before the massive World War, there was this like faith in progress going on all the time. Lovecraft, in writing the weird tales, is saying, well, what if our notion of things was radically flawed? What if there isn't the predictability or continuities? What if that's sort of just like the surface level that we like to think is the case? Actually, now that I think about it, one of the shows, do you guys remember the show from the 1970s and early 80s called Tales from the Dark Side? Mm-hmm. Remember how the intro went? It was really quite smart. The effects were really hokey because it was that time, but yeah, the idea was mankind, pays attention to this bright lit world on the surface, but there's also this dark side, this other world, and that's just as real. How does it go? It's just as real, but not as brightly lit, I think.
Right. You can remember that. That was so long.
Well, I used to watch these with my grandfather.
I did too.
Yeah.
Well, I watched them probably when they were out. You've seen the reruns. You're a lot younger. But boy, that was...
But that idea of we're not really getting... So he's doing this through fiction. He's not... Did Lovecraft really think that the world was a world in which Cthulhu existed? I don't think so, right? But is it possible that maybe the world is much different than what modern science tells us?
But then it's a proponent of an idea or a concept rather than a detached chronicler. He wrote the words. He's saying, I'm not a teacher, a sympathizer, or vendor of opinion.
That's what he's saying about Poe, yeah.
But he is.
This is an essay, too, that's very long about supernatural horror in literature, and Poe is one of the people at the start. Yeah, Lovecraft doesn't, I don't think that Cthulhu exists, right?
Maybe in the unconscious or a different world, I don't know.
Right. Well,
or the archetype of it or something.
Yeah.
He was a strict
materialist. Well, so if that was the case, though, that would be very interesting, because that would mean that we would have an archetype of something that's just, a primal horror, that it would be an archetype of something that we wouldn't be able to come to terms with, right? And that would be part of our,
that's
inheritance of human beings.
I mean, this is a dual university score.
Well,
Back to the book. I mean, so if there is this fundamental horror and ugliness, then we create the opposite to keep that at bay.
Well, or we,
in other storytelling.
Or we don't know about it. Or we don't know about it most of the time because we live in that world of habit.
But because we have to have some semblance of
a lot of
order and meaning, and you could not live in complete...
Well, Lovecraft stories, that's not a problem for 99% of the population. They've got order and meaning. It just happens to be that the order...
But they suppress the repulsive side that he's against.
Well, they don't need to until they actually encounter that sort of thing. I mean, so one of the stories that he's got that's kind of interesting for talking about this is about this old man who he encounters in, sort of the backwoods of New England. And he's an antiquarian riding on the bicycle. He wants to see these old farmhouses. And he goes in and he finds this old man who apparently he's been living for more than 100 years. And he's got this book that he traded with a sea captain. And he can't read it. It's all in Latin. But it's got these pictures in it of what are supposed to be Africans, but they're actually white, and they're butchering human beings and eating them. And the old man, is talking about how he gets a kind of a tickle when he looks at this picture, And of course, the guy realizes pretty quickly, I better get the hell out of here. And fortunately, lightning strikes the building, and it collapses, and he gets out of there before the old man can turn him into dinner. But what's going on there? Well, you've got these. So if we're talking about like the world of the metropolis, terrible things can happen, right? When there's some sort of degeneration, there's crime and stuff like that, and that's how you encounter that awful side of life. But you get all isolated into the backwoods of New England, and now there's this tendency for human beings to kind of degenerate, and they're coming into contact with these things. So the further we get from whatever counts as civilization, you're right. There's this thing that has to be kind of dealt with, And in some of the cases, it's dealt with by these terrible forces. You just worship them. You become their pawn, right? Because they're stronger than you. So that's one way to deal with it. And then but the nice bourgeois townspeople, they have no idea just how bad things actually are. And I guess the implication is, we could have a civilization where most of the people are kind of in the dark about this. Just they go on by force of habit. Either they follow traditional religion, which according to Lovecraft, that's all bunk, or they have a faith in science. And science works, but if we follow science out enough, and we're really scientific about things, we're going to start encountering things that make us feel kind of queasy and scared and upset, So yeah, I mean that's one of the themes I want to talk about is the different kinds of weird tale. Lovecraft does have these other stories where it's not horror at all; it's more fantasy. So why not have that other side? And there he's really the second guy that he talks about. I won't read through all of this, but he talks about Lord Dunassay. And he says, Dunassay was an inventor of a new mythology and weaver of surprising folklore. He stands dedicated to a strange world of fantastic beauty and pledged to eternal warfare against the coarseness and ugliness of diurnal reality. His point of view is the most truly cosmic of any held in the literature of the period. The sensitive as Poe was to dramatic values and the significance of isolated words and details, and far better equipped rhetorically through a simple lyric style based on the prose of the King James Bible. This author, that is Dunassay, draws with a tremendous effectiveness on every body of myth and legend, producing a composite or eclectic cycle. And so he's talking about this, productive fantasizing. And so some of his stories, like, the Silver Key, the Cats of Ulthar, blanking on it.
The Dream Quest.
Yeah, the Dream Quest. Those are all in this Dunasian period, right, where he's kind of under his influence. And then the Cthulhu stuff, that whole stuff comes later and continues on to the end of his life. So the scholars see like a Poe influence period, a Dunasay influence period, more fantasy stuff, and then finally the Cthulhu period in which things are, essentially cosmic horror. So this is a good transition into talking about science for Lovecraft, or we could even expand it further, rationalism. When we use this word rationalism, we're talking about a confidence in human reason and its capacities to figure out not just what the universe is, but how we ought to live, how we ought to orient our lives, what reality is, how we can be in touch with it. And science, since the rise of the modern sciences in the early modern period, from like the 1600s onward, has been the main way that we do this. And I would say, I suppose technology is also closely connected as well. And we still have a lot of people who have very, very strong faith that science will resolve all of our issues. This is kind of a battle being fought in our own culture today. The I love science meme people, great example of what we call scientism, this view that science will resolve all of our issues. Now, it turns out that when you actually start doing science, it's a lot messier than how it's portrayed, right? And there's a lot of setbacks, and it's often not quite clear precisely where the border between science and other things begins and ends. But so in Lovecraft's universe, interestingly, a lot of his characters are scientists of a sort, and they are committed to a essentially scientific viewpoint on things. And what they find out is, A, the universe is more complex than what our scientific viewpoints were able to take into account. B, when we're able to apply science to these new objects of study, like, say, a color out of space or something like that, we wind up finding out more information, but that information doesn't always make things better for us. And C, science itself is, it often gets presented as if there's an intrinsic good to knowing reality. There's an intrinsic good to doing science. In the end, science turns out to be, for Lovecraft, as meaningless as any of the other activities that we might be involved in. Meaning by that it's not giving us some sort of primal connection to whatever is most important. What it reveals to us instead is how insignificant we are, and doesn't give us any guidance about what the hell we're supposed to do after we find that out. Now, science also gives us technology and things that we can use to sort of, keep the elder, beings or these terrible things at bay, right? Once we discover it. But science, the other thing to say about science too is Lovecraft understands that science is not something that just the scientist does. It's like this continual process. So when some of the explorers make these horrifying discoveries and then close up what they found, they know somebody else is going to come along and try to follow up on that. And how do they dissuade them from that? Once you've opened the gate, it's hard to keep other people back, especially when you're being motivated by this. We have to build our knowledge. We have to develop our grasp of the universe. So there is somebody else who's not a contemporary of Lovecraft, but precedes him, and we know that Lovecraft read him, who has a somewhat similar view on science, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought that a lot of the scientists, he called them the men of science, were really just sort of the newest incarnation of religious people who he thought were fundamentally mistaken. They created values, they created whole systems of, mythologies and ways of doing things so that they could, have some order in their life, and everyone could, feel okay about what they were doing in a universe that's basically, just predatory and, for the most part, we're just, a little bit of that universe. He said science and the Enlightenment and this whole rationalist way of doing things was just the latest incarnation of that, what he called the ascetic ideal, that was originally the priest and became the philosopher and then finally the scientist. And his view was, if you were going to be really scientific about things, then you would find out that human beings and the whole world was much more terrible than the scientists were making it out to be, and that there was less natural order and much more just things developing in certain ways. There wasn't a lot of rhyme and reason to it. Truth is as in Nietzsche he said, truth is something useful. It's not something that has a value in and of itself. He called it a mobile army of metaphors in one of his essays, which is already a metaphor, of course. And so Lovecraft, it's not clear exactly how influenced Lovecraft is by Nietzsche. He's read Nietzsche. He knows people who've read Nietzsche. There were a lot of misreadings of Nietzsche at the time, this whole notion of like the Superman and all that. Lovecraft doesn't seem to be that interested in that idea. He's more interested in the cosmic implications of a universe that doesn't have any sort of order in it, or if it does, it's an order far beyond our understanding, not something that our rationality can adequately comprehend. So there's kind of a double side to science, because the longer it progresses, the more it gets us into this troubling way of looking at things. And this is where the theme of cosmic pessimism comes up. So let's say you find out that the universe is like that. And let's say you find out that a lot of what you find valuable can be explained in scientific terms, but that explaining sucks the very meaning out of the things that you care about. And even that science itself is kind of shaky, that there's more going on in the universe than just our human technology and science and rationalism. All this religious stuff that people believe in is all nonsense. Things start to look kind of dismal, especially when you add to it that we're not just like, in a universe where maybe there's no real meaning for us, but there are these horrifying creatures that antedate us, much more intelligent than us, who some of us are worshiping and want to transform the earth in ways that would, be catastrophe for certainly our civilizations, if not all of us individually. Once you find out stuff like that, that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? So this is kind of a pessimistic view on the universe. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion of this. Lovecraft didn't really consider himself a pessimist. A pessimist would be somebody who'd say, this is the worst of all possible worlds, like Arthur Schopenhauer. And Lovecraft said, no, this is just an indifferent universe. It doesn't care about us. Sort of like Ambrose Bierce is another person along these lines, It's the kind of universe that, whatever desires we have, whatever plans, whatever accounts we develop through science, the universe doesn't care one way or the other. So, you could be, in some ways, liberated and more optimistic about that. You say, well, life is what you make of it. If you want to do science, go ahead and do science. You want to worship the elder beings, go ahead and do that, right? You want to just do artwork and, be influenced by, through your dreams and make some creative things about ghouls. Okay, go ahead and do that too. That's nice,
But I guess I see that philosophy in Lovecraft or wherever it orientates or comes from as is really, I guess pessimistic, but I mean turning to the fear side, and it comes maybe from man setting himself apart, above, detached.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a whole nother philosophy that would say if humans felt themselves integrated with the universe, they would more go with the flow. And others could say, well, that's fatalism or that's whatever. But I guess I think there's really two different philosophies here, and
I think
we don't in the West see that much of the alternative, yet it's out there. And I think this form of view of the universe and the function of religion or the function of science really comes from where the person or the human race feels itself set as different, and therefore when there's something else big out there that we don't grasp and understand, then we feel threatened because we've set ourselves apart, as opposed to having communion with it or being a part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. That would be another option, or you could just have a sense of awe, or be almost like a cosmic tourist going around, right?
But, well, I think
seek out beauty.
Again, some of my science fiction comes from movies, more than reading, at least in the last whatever number of years.
Yeah.
So I saw that Spielberg was really trying to cut a different road with the story of E.T. Because a lot of science fiction had been
Close Encounters.
The Godzilla and Close Encounters. I mean, but a lot of it before that had really been this threatening, this almost, oh my God, come to be scared.
Yeah.
It could have been a modern day Lovecraft sort of.
Well, like Alien, for example.
I mean, but they were trying to break free and says maybe there's this wonderful, peaceful, much more pleasant. We ought to look more optimistically and be part of this rather than set ourselves differently, and so I think that was a real different sort of science fiction, if you want to call it science fiction. Right?
No, I think you're right, and I think you're
different philosophies. Worldviews, universe views.
Yeah, I mean Lovecraft, I think, saw himself as very often when we have this optimist realist debate. Both groups of people want to say, I'm not a pessimist, right? I'm a realist, And the optimists, when they're accused of being unduly optimistic, will sometimes say things like that too. And probably they are, in a sense, both realists, because they are usually picking out aspects of situations that the other side isn't seeing, right? Now, usually they go wrong by insisting too strongly on how their side has got it totally right and the other side's got it totally wrong, right? And Lovecraft could have gone a different way, and in a few of the stories he does go a different way. The stories that are more influenced by Lord Dunassy and are, sort of straight out fantasy, where these people are going to these cool locations and witnessing these wonderful things, and there isn't, some horrible eldritch terror in the back that's going to come in and crash everything. Once you've got something like Cthulhu, or Nyarlathotep, or one of these other elder, or old ones on the scene, it's all bad, and you got to figure out where you're going to place yourself. Are you going to give in to them? Having sort of communion with them, communion with some being whose mind we can't comprehend and who just seems to want to consume us. Well, then that seems kind of bad, and that's more like, Alien, right? Or that whole sequence.
Yeah, but what was the movie we just saw 6 months ago?
I'm trying to think of the name of it.
With the woman who's the scientist.
It's Arrival by
Arrival.
Yeah.
No, that was the very thing where, in a very non-verbal sense, people on Earth had no idea. They looked like blobs, totally threatening. We're going to drop nukes on them and everything.
Yeah.
Yet there was an intelligence there, and there was this great struggle. I mean, it's a really good storyline. I thought, very well done.
Yeah, and it shows that narrative is just as possible as Aliens or Independence Day or whatever alien it is. It's a bad guy. I mean, it could be something silly like that one with the Martians that have the brains in they're coming to steal the women. Mars Attacks, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's still in that same genre of, well, if we'd known that those Martians are such bastards, we would have had to, oppose them from the beginning.
All of this is all human construct because we can't go anywhere
You're right,
else.
yeah.
We can't go anywhere else. I mean, everything that we come up with is all we can do. It's all we can know. I mean, or imagine.
You say human construct, but
It
then,
is.
I go to Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, and
I see.
how we plug into things that are totally, you cannot begin to explain, yet there is a commonality of communication across time and place, certainly, and things come up, whether they be patterns and images, and then blend into stories or song. And so, reaching apart into other species is not that big of a jump, and maybe the bacteria all around us is just as intelligent and informative for us, but we sure don't think about it.
Well, it's interesting because the more that we're finding out in our own time, and we should, keep in mind that our scientific understanding of the universe is far advanced beyond that of the time of Lovecraft. We're discovering things like the symbiotic relationship between us and our bacterial flora, right? And how important that is. It's not something Lovecraft couldn't have conceived of. And we have, the other thing to think about too, and now we're getting quite far away from Lovecraft, is just how much resources we have to devote to doing that kind of research compared to back then. We have so many more people on the problems, you could say, than they did. So maybe it leads to a different sort of narrative.
Well, they could imagine the things that we're just now finding out about, too. I mean, some of that, it has to go to the collective unconscious, that somehow it was in the imagination, like parallel universes and string theory. I mean, how many people were talking about parallel universes, and now that's coming to fruition with string theory and stuff like that. So I think at some point, there's something there in the imagination that puts it out that later on becomes provable.
And that goes back to an openness of mind in terms of approaching the other. Not a fearfulness against the other because it's going to undercut or threaten me.
Yeah. So let's talk then. One of the themes that comes up with Lovecraft, and I don't think this fully explains the why is the other terrifying. I don't think it goes all the way there, but it is something that's really clear in his work. Is you could call it a racialist mentality, and a sort of prioritizing of the Anglo over everybody, because the other Europeans can be completely degenerate too, right? Spaniards, Frenchmen, and all that. They got to watch out for them. But good Anglo stock is going to count for something. Lovecraft is writing in a time when a racism with a scientific veneer to it was pretty deeply rooted in the culture. The 19th century had given rise to this. It's very strong in America, very strong in England, very strong in Germany as well. And he over and over again, he's got characters. So I guess you could say there's like all these other peoples, right? And they're definitely not European, and so they're probably, there's not much culture there. Whatever culture they have is still primitive. It's still within the realm of religion. They don't have any real science. If they did, then they'd start behaving like us civilized people, is the notion, right? And
that goes back to the identity at the time.
Yeah.
And the prime imperative was what we now, or maybe even then, called manifest destiny, material wealth, and we judge the value of things in terms of when they generated material wealth to somebody.
And he is writing from Yankeetown, you can say, right? Because he's in New England, and he is from that stock, and you see this in some of his stories where he talks about like these immigrants coming in. like those Italians, or even darker people with more incomprehensible tongues, and it's over and over and over and over again throughout his works. It's like a constant fixture, and does that go somewhat to explaining this fear of the other, this notion that the other threatens your culture, that you're the apex of humanity, and everything else is sort of downhill, and you can't do very much with all those people. I think it does go somewhat to explain
it. Threatens their identity, their wealth, their well-being.
There's just kind of xenophobia around.
Yeah. It was more psychological.
I don't know that it goes all the way to explaining why the whole universe would be populated by these beings like Azazoth, this blind, pulsating like star or something at the center of things, around which all these lesser gods keep court piping insane. I mean, that doesn't. I don't think
that was Dunsany actually. He picked it up from him.
Okay.
Dunsany has a sort of
similar mad piping.
An idiot god at the center of the world who's sleeping to a cosmic piper, and if he ever wakes up, our universe pops like a bubble because we're just a dream.
Well,
so that's Dunsany's version of cosmic pessimism. It's a bit more whimsical.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can get that from racism, right? No matter how hard you try, because what would race have anything to do with that? That's about sort of cosmic beings. But I think a lot of there's a fear too of miscegenation, right? And for example, The Shadow over Innsmouth, you have these people that bred with these sea creatures, and eventually the narrator actually finds out that he himself is from that family, and he's going to have to go under the sea to be with them. But a lot of the commentators think this reflects the sort of fears about race mixing at the time that a lot of people had, which were, pretty. I mean, when you read some of the stuff that these people thought would happen when you mix races, it sounds pretty awful, and you're like, where did you get these? How did you get these ideas? Especially when there's common experience of seeing people who were mixed race and they turned out okay.
So some of that came out of their sense of religion.
A lot of that.
There's one true Christian white religion. And all others need fall aside. You're subservient. I mean, however you want to communicate. I mean, that's where it came from, I think. But not that was the original message. I mean, but that's how it got twisted over time for material gain, is what I look at it.
Yeah, and Lovecraft rejects all that. He thinks Judaism and Christianity, they're just bunk, But I think he was influenced. The one thing that's kind of interesting is, even being the right race doesn't mean that you won't degenerate for Lovecraft, So you do have these very Anglo characters, and they have to be worried. Like Lovecraft was, think about it, in his family, the other thing that people were very worried about at the time is, if you had somebody in your family who went insane, you're probably tainted. And you can go insane too.
Yeah. But that came out of the religion too. If you're really sick, you're on the bad side of God. Because you did something.
Oh, the notion of like ancestral sin or something, I suppose. Yeah.
What would be interesting to me, in a sense, this is just a sidebar.
Yeah.
If you took, this is all Western world. If you took somebody in China, educated, whatever, born in 1890, died at age 47 or whatever, and who was a writer, who had some sense of their industrial revolution and development, whether it came from the West or came from within their 5,000 years of culture and development. How would that contrast? And see, we have no idea. There's a Chinese world out there of 5,000 years that we are just totally oblivious to.
Oh yeah, they won the Hugo the other day.
No, but I'm saying back at this time, to do a contrast with a Lovecraft, to say, if they're approaching the same questions about the validity of past culture, religion, world order, universal views,
what the universe really is.
How did they come to?
They would take their cultural root.
No, but it might be kind of interesting Chinese science fiction. I don't know, or fantasy.
Well, they do have
we don't know
Chinese
about it,
fiction,
but
they do. You can look it up.
Well, there were. One thing that we'd have to deal with is the fact that China went into massive disorder, if we have this person, right, born in 1890 and then dies in...
It's probably a bad time for China to think there was any continuity, but there probably wasn't.
Well, I mean, they were being influenced by the West, right? Their technology was developing. You're right, they have this much longer, vaster history behind them. But there was like a struggle going on for, what is China? And it was political and it was intellectual. Unfortunately, it ends up in the Chinese Civil War, which took lots and lots of lives. And then, by the time that we're talking about 1937, Japan had already invaded China too. I don't know enough about Chinese literature to even really speculate. Contemporary 20th century Chinese literature. I know bits and pieces about classical Chinese literature, but that wouldn't make me competent to say anything about what. Maybe there was a Chinese Lovecraft, or correspondent to him. Who knows? It'd be quite interesting to think about. The other thing that I was going to talk about, and we just have a few minutes before they're going to probably want to kick us out, is this notion of the indescribable that Lovecraft plays with over and over again. It's always dicey to say that something is unimaginable or indescribable or something like that in literature, because you are already describing it by calling it indescribable. There's a paradox there, right? The way that language works. I personally think that Lovecraft does a pretty good job in, like I said, going up to the limit and then not going further in talking about, how these beings or cities or whatever he wants to describe what they're like. And that's part of the aspect of horror as well. A lot of people think that he went far too far on that, and that his writing is terrible as a result. And he has a story, I don't think it's in the ones that I've got here. I think it's called The Indescribable.
The Unnameable is on.
The Unnameable, that's right. So he's got a friend. Yeah, he's got a friend who's making fun of him as a writer for making too often recourse to the unnameable. And then his friend, of course, is the very scientific guy, and eventually encounters the unnameable and has to agree that it truly is unnameable. So Lovecraft vindicates himself.
They literally wake up in a hospital room with weird bruises and scars.
Yeah.
Like one is like an ox hoof on his face, but there's no other sign of an ox being present. And they're just like, whatever it was indescribable.
Yeah.
It's like the only one where people survive to the end too, because.
But think about it. What is Lovecraft doing there? He's telling his critics, my use of this language really is justified. So I guess there's kind of an interesting paradox there.
He could have a sense of humor about it.
Yeah, there's not a lot of humor in
Not
the
stories. No. In his nonfiction, he did some parodies and stuff.
That's true. Yeah, I imagine he must have been. And I don't know that much about his biography, like people saying what he was like as a person, but I imagine he must have had a kind of biting sense of humor. Otherwise, he'd have been pretty glum to be with. Well, I don't have any other remarks myself, but we can certainly talk more if you'd like to. Or, if you've got questions, I can answer them as best as I can. But, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Where should I, because, I'm interested. This talk is very...
Oh, in Lovecraft?
Yeah. Where should I start? Yeah. Because, it sounds like there's
That's an interesting question.
I was going to ask the same question.
Yeah, so he's been anthologized so many times, and none of the anthologies have exactly the same stories, right? These are some nice ones that I bought here at half price, right? But I bought it because they were cheap, and I wanted to have some Lovecraft around. And these aren't bad, but you could just get anything from the library that's by Lovecraft that has some of the stories and just start working your way through them. I don't think that one has to read them in any sort of order. you know, because they're not, you know, it's not like reading, say, if you're going to read the Song of Ice and Fire, well, you better begin with Game of Thrones, right? Don't start, you know, with the 5th book, because you're not going to understand half of what's going on. Right? It's not like that.
Any what's going on.
Yeah. Well, even after you have read the 1st book and the other ones, it's still a little confusing at times because there's just too many characters. It's not a narrative universe like that where you've got all that continuity.
Looking at his biography, considering all the horrible things that happened to his family pretty early on in his life, how much I'm asking you in general, would you think that focused his worldview? Yeah.
So looking at the darker sides of things?
I mean, his dad went to an institution and died before he was 10. His mom, right around when
she gets sick,
30, and goes to the same hospital. This
grandfather dies.
The family gets tossed into the street, it sounds like.
Well, they had to go to a smaller house, so they weren't like totally destitute, but it was tough.
Bad housing plays a role in some of his stories too.
Yeah.
Dreams in the Witch House, Rats in the Walls.
Yeah, and people usually they're taking the place because it's a bargain.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's the one with the fungus.
If his folks wouldn't have, if those things wouldn't have happened, would we be talking about the happy stories of H.P. Lovecraft?
You know, I think it's not just that. I think it's also that you couldn't really talk with other people that you were used to talking with about these sorts of things. You know, you didn't want anyone to know that your dad had gone crazy, right? So who could he have talked about other than his own family members? Some of whom may be going crazy themselves, you know,
or would be like, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
Is he a single child? No sibling?
Yeah.
That makes a difference. Okay.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. I mean,
well, there's not a lot of security in his life at all, and I think that's why he probably married on the fly, just for trying to find some kind of security. And it just seems like he
seemed to really like
that
her.
influenced his writing too. It's just, you know, this.
Yeah. Well, he's with her for 4 years. It wasn't quite on the fly.
Oh, well, she's gone for a good bit of it.
It wasn't an intimate marriage. But.
I mean, like she said, he performed satisfactorily, so they were intimate at one time. You know.
Physically.
Yeah. I mean, they liked each other.
Because he got along well with the people he wrote with. He seemed to do better in writing than in person.
Yeah.
Speaking of people he was writing, who's Arthur Machen?
Oh, he's awesome.
Okay.
He's a Welsh writer from the turn of the century. And
speculative fiction?
Speculative fiction, kind of weird fiction. The Great God Pan is about brain surgery gone wrong. My sister's writing her doctoral thesis on it. So,
oh, wow.
Brain surgery gone
he
wrong,
also wrote a bit about World War I. The Terror is sort of a suspense story that might or might not be supernatural. He's pretty fun.
What was the brain surgery one again?
The Great God Pan.
Yeah. The brain surgery opens up like understanding of the universe.
She sees too much, and she also has a baby.
Okay.
Supernatural horror and literature, his essay is really great for an overview of the writers he liked.
Okay.
So it's good for recommendations.
I've heard of him before.
Especially if you wind up not liking Lovecraft,
That
supernatural.
one you can find
literature's a
online
good
too.
place.
Actually, you can find most of Lovecraft stuff online. That to go to the question, because it went into the public domain.
Yeah.
So
and
you can find it. You can find it read on LibriVox too.
So that explains too why people. I mean, there's games,
movies,
TV shows.
Yeah, you don't have to pay anybody.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not a state to pay,
Or
to put the kibosh on stuff.
Yeah.
But it also explains why there's so many anthologies, because you know, anybody can anthologize public domain stuff, right? So if we want to put together the best of Lovecraft according to all of us, we can do that.